So welcome. This is the first of the snippets for the week of the 27th. So this is going to basically look at the run-up to World War II, U.S. rule there, and then the first 2 years of the war before the U.S. enters the war. So on the screen here, we have the map of Germany, basically post-Versailles. So here's Germany itself. This striped area of Rhineland is under German possession, but was demilitarized as a result of the war, as a result of the peace treaty. So the idea here is that make it harder for Germany to attack Belgium or France because they'd have to march their troops through the Rhineland. Austria is ethnic German, but was separated from Germany. And then this purple area, this is the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, where a lot of the Czech defenses are, but this too is an ethnic German area. And as the Nazis come to power, this part of Czechoslovakia, remember, is the only democracy in this part of Europe. This part of Czechoslovakia swings very heavily towards a political party called the Sudeten German Party, which is basically an affiliate of the Nazis. So this is the situation as of 1936, and this contrast here gives a sense of how Hitler played things. So on the left, we see German troops moving into the Rhineland in violation of the Versailles Peace Treaty. On the right, we see a Nazi propaganda magazine with Hitler sowing the seeds of peace in the run-up to the 1936 Olympic Games. This is sort of Nazi propaganda. So Hitler's argument is that he's not really invading anything. He's simply sending troops into German soil. The irony here is that if the French had sent troops in to uphold Versailles, to keep the German military out of the Rhineland, the top leadership of the German military had issued orders saying that if there's a French resistance, we need to pull back out. But what Hitler correctly understood is that the British and the Germans, the British and the French, were so traumatized by World War I that they would not send troops to resist the German action. And similarly, the Nazi Olympics of 1936 are basically a propaganda event for Nazism. And this photograph on the left is a very famous photo with the Nazi flag kind of literally overshadowing the Olympic rings. The one twist for Hitler is that Jesse Owens, a star Black American athlete, does spectacularly well at the games, and so one of the purposes of the games was to show the superiority of the Aryan race, and Hitler is unable to, at the very least, do that. This Olympic Games is also one of the most shameful episodes in the history of the U.S. Olympic Committee. There were two Jewish athletes who made the Olympic teams on the track relay teams, and the Nazis pressured the U.S. Olympic Committee not to send these Jewish athletes to the games, and the U.S. Olympic Committee, the chair, of a guy named Avery Brundage, bows to the pressure and excludes these athletes who had, again, made the team from participating. As all of this is going on, though, Congress is resolute that the U.S. made a mistake in getting involved in World War I and should not get involved in World War II. Remember, we looked at this last week. Congress in 1935 passes the Neutrality Act. Down here at the bottom is Gerald Nye, the Republican senator from North Dakota, who chairs the committee inquiring into the U.S. entry into World War I. And the Neutrality Act says that all U.S.-owned companies cannot supply war materiel to countries at war, and that American citizens should stay out. And if they choose to travel to a war zone, they're on their own. The U.S. government has no obligation to do anything. And this measure passes overwhelmingly in Congress. So this is the situation that Roosevelt is facing. He recognizes the danger that Hitler poses, but he's also dealing with a Congress that is very, very reluctant, for understandable reasons, for the U.S. To get involved. And then, as all of this happens, we get the events in East Asia start to reemerge. So we see the expansion of the Japanese empire in East Asia as we move into the 1930s. So Japan, before World War I, already had seized Taiwan and Korea. Then in the 1930s, early 30s, they seized Manchuria. And then in 1935, 36, 37, they start to move south. And they launch, they launch an invasion of China. They attack the Chinese city of Nanjing, and in a kind of brutal occupation, beset by war crimes, they try to sort of shatter the Chinese morale. What the Japanese, at the end of the day, don't realize is China's a big country, and invading it is going to be a more difficult task than they had realized. Japan by this point is basically a military dictatorship. I mean, there's a kind of nominal civilian government, but not really much. The European countries basically tell China, we're sorry this is happening to you, but you're sort of on your own. They're concerned with Hitler, and it's the U.S. that most strongly defends the Chinese, although it's mostly rhetorical. FDR's response to the Japanese attack on Nanjing is to issue a radio address in which he compares events in East Asia to an infectious disease and argues that just as you would quarantine an infectious disease, so too the international community needs to work against aggressors. So here's a taste of Roosevelt's remarks.
It seems to be unfortunately true that the epidemic of world lawlessness is spreading. And mark this well, when an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in a quarantine of the patients in order to protect the health of the community against the spread of the disease. War is a contagion, whether it be declared or undeclared. It can engulf states and peoples remote from the original scene of hostilities. Yes, we are determined to keep out of war, yet we cannot insure ourselves against the disastrous effects of war and the dangers of involvement. We are adopting such measures as will minimize our risk of involvement, but we cannot have complete protection in a world of disorder in which confidence and security have broken down.
And recall that Roosevelt is addressing an audience that would remember the Spanish flu. So the Spanish flu is immediately after World War I. So they would understand this quarantine reference. What Roosevelt wants Americans to do is to understand, look, if the world is all going to hell, it's unlikely that the U.S. is going to be able to avoid this, just as we all experienced. He's telling his listeners in 1918 and 1919 that the U.S. could not separate itself from the effects of the Spanish flu. Now, at the end of the day, Roosevelt really doesn't do much to help the Chinese, at least at this stage of the game. But he's prepping and trying to persuade public opinion, and he's relatively effective at this. Public opinion starts to shift in the late 1930s, even though it will remain anti-outright intervention through 1941. Even though the attack on Nanjing sort of integrates Japan and China into this crisis community, the key problem in the late 30s remains in Europe. In late 1938, there are a couple of critical developments. The first is Kristallnacht, the pogrom by the Nazis in the fall of 1938, that basically symbolizes that this is a regime that's going to wage war in all ways on its Jewish population. The U.S. response to this is, and the response basically of every country in the world to this is minimal. Jewish refugees are largely abandoned. The most famous of these episodes is the voyage of the St. Louis. This is a refugee vessel that travels to Cuba. The U.S. policy at this point was that if to get in, you needed a visa, and no American diplomats in Europe are granting visas to Jewish refugees. But there is a rumor that there's an American diplomat in Havana, Cuba, who will grant the visas. So the ship takes off for for Havana. By the time it gets there, the diplomat has been recalled. It travels close to Miami. There are stories how the refugees can actually see the lights of Miami, but they are prevented from landing. And eventually, the ship has to return all the way to Europe. And most of the people, the refugees who were on this, will be killed in the Holocaust. And I mean, the U.S. response here is no different than other countries. The British basically close off the Palestine mandate to ensure that Jews will not be able to get to will be the future Israel. The French are a little more interested in accepting Jewish refugees, but not much. So that's the first thing, that we have this unparalleled humanitarian crisis in the 20th century, and the international community's response is basically to do nothing. And then we have the second crisis is Hitler attempting to redo the map of Europe. He begins in the spring of 1938 by annexing Austria, and new propaganda posters at the time in Germany. So we don't have Hitler spreading the seeds of peace anymore. Here he is saying, that there's one German Reich, that all Germans should be under the control of the German government, and under the control of him. This is a photograph. The photograph on the right is a photograph of Vienna after the Nazi invasion. And it's worth remembering, Austria reimagines itself after World War II as the first victim of Nazi aggression. The idea is that in March of 1938, the Germans invade independent Austria. It's to a certain extent true, but as you can see from the photo, there's a rapturous welcome for Hitler in Austria as well. The annexation of Austria, which is called the Anschluss, the most significant effect for this is Czechoslovakia. So remember, Czechoslovakia in the 20s was part of the Little Entente, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia, all of them aligned with France. The Czechs had built up a quite formidable army in the 20s and 30s. They are the only functioning democracy in Eastern or Central Europe by the 1930s. They have a close relationship with France. They have diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, one of the few countries in Europe to do so. The annexation of Austria causes a real problem for them because the Czechs had built up their defenses in the Sudetenland on the German border. They were worried about a German attack even before Hitler came to power. But they didn't build up defenses on the Austrian border because Austria was quite weak during the interwar period. So suddenly now the Czechs are exposed to German attacks from the south. There's a war scare a couple weeks after the Anschluss, but the Nazis push back. But by the fall of 1938, Hitler says that he's going to annex the German areas of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia has an alliance with France. They go to France and say, look, if we're attacked, we expect you to come to our aid. And the French very, very reluctantly agree. Britain has an alliance with France. So if France goes to war on Czechoslovakia's behalf, Britain will be in the war as well. And at that point, the international community intervenes. Here's the linguistic map of Czechoslovakia. So we see the German areas here in blue. This is the Sudetenland on the border. The pink areas are Czech areas. The Czech government is hurt by the fact that in the eastern part of the country, Slovaks, Ruthenians, and Hungarians sense weakness in the central government, and they try to exploit the Nazi pressure. The Czech president is this man, Edvard Beneš, who had previously been foreign minister of Czechoslovakia, had been president of the League of Nations Council, is someone who, he in some ways, he kind of embodies the 1920s internationalism approach. And suddenly now he's heading this besieged democracy surrounded by totalitarian, racist, authoritarian regimes. At the end of the day, the Czechs are betrayed by the West. Neville Chamberlain, who is the Prime Minister of Britain and who is a strong opponent of going to war on Czechoslovakia's behalf, requests a meeting with Hitler. Eventually, there are two Chamberlain-Hitler meetings. The second of them includes the Prime Minister of France, Edouard Daladier, and the leader of Italy, Benito Mussolini. And this four-power meeting, which excludes the Czechs, also excludes the Americans and excludes the Soviets, convenes at Munich and agrees that Czechoslovakia will be told that they must pull out all of their forces from this Sudeten area by the end of September 1938. And if they choose to resist, that France will consider its alliance null and void with Czechoslovakia, and they will get no foreign assistance of any type. This is decimating to the Czech government, because this is where they built their defenses. So if they lose this area, they've lost their defense. This is called appeasement. Chamberlain's philosophy is that the British need time to rebuild, and that also there's a chance maybe if Hitler is given some concessions in Eastern Europe, he'll choose not to attack Western Europe. The Munich conference is now seen as a, almost universally seen as a moral and a strategic failure, but that was not the case at the time. And you can get a sense of this. This is from a news clip. This is from the BBC, welcoming Chamberlain back. And, this is not the welcoming of someone who has committed a moral failure. So let's take a quick listen.
The settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace. This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains, but I would just like to read it to you. We, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister have had a further meeting today and are agreed in recognizing that the question of Anglo-German relations is of the first importance for the two countries and for Europe. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
At this Munich conference, Hitler promises Chamberlain that he has no interest in any further expansion. Chamberlain, who is not a fool, believes it's a good example of motivated reasoning. He wants to believe that Hitler is not going to occupy anyone else, because Chamberlain, in his position, again, this is a country whose kind of college-educated elite was wiped out by World War I. In Chamberlain's mind, it would be irrational to want a world war. He can't sort of imagine Hitler. Hitler doesn't fulfill the agreement. In the spring of 1939, he annexes the remaining Czech territory, Bohemia and Moravia. He supports the creation of a puppet state in Slovakia, and allows his allies, the Hungarians, to annex the southern portion of Czechoslovakia and also Ruthenia. In effect, what happens to the Czechs is kind of a reverse Article 10. Remember, Article 10 was collective security. It said if you're a weak country and you're attacked by a stronger country, all of the members of the League of Nations will come to your defense. In the case of the Czechs, it was the international community that actively assisted Hitler in dismembering the country, eliminating the last democracy in Central Europe, and critically ensuring that when World War II would start, the strongest pro-Western military in Central Eastern Europe would no longer exist. So our next step is going to look at the run-up to the war and then the beginning of fighting.